The blood-red sun dipped below the dusty horizon of Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1876, casting long shadows across the weathered planks of Main Street just as Rebecca Jones stepped from the stagecoach, her fingers clutching a worn leather satchel and her other hand protectively resting on her swollen belly. Whispers erupted instantly, hushed voices traveling like wildfire through the small frontier town as townsfolk paused to stare at the beautiful young woman unmarried, with child, and entirely alone. Rebecca kept her head high despite the burning in her cheeks. At 22 years old, she had weathered enough storms to know that dignity was often a woman's only shield in a world eager to strip it away. Her emerald eyes scanned the unfamiliar street, looking for the small boarding house where she'd arranged lodging through correspondence with the elderly widow who owned it. "Well, I never," came a sharp voice from her right. An older woman in a severe black dress clutched her reticule tighter, as if Rebecca's condition might be contagious. The moral decay of our times knows no bounds. Rebecca's throat tightened, but she continued forward, dust clinging to the hem of her faded blue traveling dress. 6 months along now, there was no hiding her condition, though she'd tried with loosened corsets and strategically draped shawls during her journey west. She had chosen Bitter Creek specifically because it was far from Boston, far from the scandal, and far from the married banker who had promised her the world before discarding her like yesterday's newspaper when she'd told him about the baby. "Miss Jones," a kind voice broke through her thoughts. A plump, gray-haired woman approached with a tentative smile. "I'm Mrs. Harris. We exchanged letters about the room." Rebecca nodded gratefully. "Yes, thank you, for you didn't mention your condition," Mrs. Harris whispered, her smile faltering as her eyes dropped to Rebecca's abdomen. I can explain," Rebecca stammered, though no explanation would satisfy. The truth was too painful, too humiliating. "There's nothing to explain," came a deep, resonant voice from behind them. Rebecca turned to see a tall man dismounting from a magnificent Palomino stallion. The stranger's face was partially obscured by the brim of his Stetson, but she could make out a strong jaw darkened with stubble and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through her. "Xavier King," he introduced himself, striding forward with the easy confidence of a man who commanded respect without asking for it. His gaze swept over Rebecca, lingering on her belly before returning to her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You finally made it, darling." Rebecca's brow furrowed in confusion, but before she could speak, Xavier stepped closer, removing his hat to reveal thick chestnut hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He couldn't have been more than 28, with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of days spent in the saddle rather than behind a desk. "I apologize for not meeting your coach," he said, his voice carrying just enough for the growing crowd of onlookers to hear. The north pasture fence needed mending before nightfall. Mrs. Harris looked between them, perplexed. "You know this woman, Mr. King?" A slow smile spread across Xavier's face, revealing a slight dimple in his right cheek. "Know her, Mrs. Harris, this is my wife." Gasps rippled through the gathered townsfolk. Rebecca stood frozen, her mind racing to make sense of this stranger's claim. "Your wife," Mrs. Harris repeated, disbelief evident in her tone, but she reserved a room as Miss Jones. Xavier's arm slid around Rebecca's waist with a casual familiarity that sent a shock through her system. "We were married back east. Rebecca wanted to use her maiden name until I could properly establish us here." His thumb traced small circles against her side as he spoke, a gesture both comforting and confusingly intimate. "I've been getting our home ready these past months." Rebecca remained silent, too stunned to contradict him yet unable to understand why this handsome stranger would insert himself into her predicament with such a bold lie. "Then why is she staying at my boarding house?" Mrs. Harris pressed, suspicion evident in her narrowed eyes. "She's not," Xavier replied smoothly. "She'll be coming home with me where she belongs." He turned to Rebecca, his expression softening. I've finished the nursery just like I promised. The mention of a nursery broke through Rebecca's shock. Tears pricked at her eyes as she realized what this man was doing, offering her protection with a simple claim. In a single moment, he had transformed her from fallen woman to respectable wife. "Xavier," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper as she tested his name on her lips for the first time. "Let me take your bag, sweetheart," he said, gently removing the satchel from her grip. His fingers brushed against hers, warm and calloused. "You must be exhausted from your journey." Mrs. Harris's expression had shifted from suspicion to embarrassment. "I had no idea, Mr. King. You never mentioned. Some things a man likes to keep close to his heart, Mrs. Harris." Xavier interrupted with a wink that somehow managed to be both charming and slightly dangerous. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I'd like to take my wife home." The crowd began to disperse, though Rebecca could still hear the murmurs of speculation. Xavier guided her toward his horse, his hand a steady pressure against the small of her back. "I don't understand," Rebecca whispered once they were out of earshot. "Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." Xavier helped her mount the palomino before swinging up behind her, his chest a solid wall of warmth against her back. "Let's get you somewhere private before we talk," he murmured, his breath tickling her ear. "This town feeds on gossip like wolves on a wounded deer." They rode in silence through the main street, Rebecca acutely aware of the curious stares following them. Xavier's arms encircled her as he held the reins, creating a protective cocoon that felt both foreign and oddly comforting. The palomino carried them beyond the town limits to a modest but well-maintained ranch house nestled in a grove of cottonwoods. A barn and corral stood to one side, while a small vegetable garden flourished beside the house. It was simple but charming, the kind of home Rebecca had once dreamed of before life took a crueler turn. Xavier dismounted first, then reached up to help her down, his hands spanning her waist with gentle strength. "Watch your step," he cautioned as her feet touched the ground. Standing before him now, Rebecca searched his face for some clue to his motivations. "Mr. King, Xavier," he corrected, leading the horse toward a hitching post. "Xavier," she amended. "I appreciate your intervention back there, but I don't understand why you would claim me as your wife. You've tied yourself to a complete stranger, a pregnant one at that." He secured the horse before turning to face her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Let's get you inside. It's getting cold and you look like you could use some tea." The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly comfortable, with simple but solid furniture and touches that spoke of care. Embroidered cushions on the sofa, a vase of wildflowers on the dining table, and shelves lined with books. It wasn't what she expected from a bachelor cowboy's home. Xavier busied himself at the stove, hanging a kettle over the fire. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a cushioned rocking chair. "You shouldn't be on your feet after such a long journey." Rebecca sank into the chair gratefully, her hand automatically moving to soothe the baby, who had started kicking vigorously. "You still haven't answered my question," she persisted. "Why did you claim me?" Xavier's shoulders tensed slightly as he measured tea leaves into a chipped porcelain pot. "I know what it's like to be judged unfairly," he said finally, his back still to her. "This town, they're good people at heart, but they're quick to condemn what they don't understand. That doesn't explain why you'd saddle yourself with Rebecca's voice caught, with someone in my situation." He turned then, leaning against the counter as he studied her. 2 years ago, my sister found herself in a similar predicament. The man who promised to marry her vanished when he learned she was with child. His jaw tightened at the memory. She tried to make it on her own, but the whispers and accusations drove her to desperate measures. Rebecca's heart clenched. "What happened to her?" "She died," Xavier said simply, the words hanging heavy in the air. "Bleeding out after attempting to rid herself of the problem." She was 19. "I'm so sorry," Rebecca whispered, understanding dawning on her. "So when you saw me today?" "I saw history repeating itself," he finished, pouring the boiling water into the teapot. I couldn't stand by and watch another woman suffer that fate, not if I could prevent it. Rebecca watched him, this stranger who had appointed himself her protector. It's a generous offer, but I can't accept it. The lie will be discovered eventually, and then we'll both face the consequences. Xavier brought her a steaming cup of tea, the fragrant steam rising between them. It doesn't have to be a lie, he said carefully, his blue eyes meeting hers. We could make it real. Rebecca nearly choked on her first sip. Mr. King, Xavier, you can't possibly be suggesting a marriage of convenience, he clarified, taking a seat across from her. On paper, we'd be husband and wife. You'd have my name, my protection, and a home for your child. I have a successful ranch, plenty of space, and could use a woman's touch around the place. And what would you get from this arrangement? Rebecca asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. She had learned the hard way that men rarely offered something for nothing. A shadow of a smile crossed his face. Respectability. The town's been pressuring me to settle down for years. The bachelor-rancher routine gets old after a while. He paused, his expression growing more serious. And I'd get the satisfaction of knowing I didn't fail another woman the way I failed my sister. Rebecca set her cup down carefully. This is madness. You know nothing about me. I know you're brave enough to travel alone across the country while carrying a child, Xavier countered. I know you're proud enough to hold your head high despite the stares and whispers, and I know you're practical enough to consider an offer that benefits us both. She couldn't deny his logic, but the enormity of what he proposed left her reeling. Would you expect marital rights? She asked bluntly, a flush spreading across her cheeks. Xavier's expression remained neutral, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. No, this would be a partnership, not a love match. Separate bedrooms, mutual respect. He hesitated before adding, at least until we decide otherwise. The kettle whistled, slicing through the tension. Xavier rose to remove it from the heat, giving Rebecca a moment to collect her thoughts. Marriage to a stranger seemed ludicrous, yet the alternative, facing the town's scorn alone, struggling to find work as an unwed mother, possibly losing her child to poverty or illness, seemed far worse. I need time to think, she said finally. Xavier nodded. Of course. You can stay here tonight in the spare room, he added quickly. Tomorrow you can give me your answer. He showed her to a small but clean bedroom, furnished with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a rocking chair by the window. The washroom is down the hall, he explained. I've left fresh towels and soap for you. As he turned to leave, Rebecca called after him. Why did you say you'd prepared a nursery? Was that just part of the ruse? A peculiar expression crossed Xavier's face, something between sadness and determination. It wasn't a lie, he said quietly. After Sarah died, I finished the nursery she had started for her baby. It's been waiting for a purpose ever since. With that, he closed the door, leaving Rebecca alone with her thoughts and the impossible decision before her. Dawn broke over the ranch in gentle waves of pink and gold, filtering through the thin curtains of Rebecca's borrowed room. She had barely slept, her mind racing between options, weighing the safety and stability Xavier offered against the strangeness of binding herself to a man she'd just met. The baby kicked insistently as she dressed, a reminder of the stakes. Whatever decision she made would affect not just her life but her child's as well. The smell of coffee and frying bacon drew her to the kitchen, where she found Xavier at the stove, his sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. He glanced over his shoulder as she entered, offering a cautious smile. Good morning, he said. I hope you slept well. Well enough, she replied, taking a seat at the table. Thank you for your hospitality. Xavier placed a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits before her. Eat, he encouraged. The baby needs it, even if your appetite is poor. The thoughtfulness of the gesture wasn't lost on Rebecca. She picked up her fork and took a small bite of eggs, surprised to find herself suddenly ravenous. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Xavier spoke again. I realize I put you in an awkward position yesterday, he said, refilling her coffee cup. If you choose to decline my offer, I'll help you find suitable accommodations in town. I know a few families who might hire a housekeeper or nanny without asking too many questions. Rebecca studied him across the table. In the morning light, she could see faint lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. There was a steadiness to him that she found reassuring, a quality sorely lacking in the sophisticated banker who had wooed and abandoned her. "Before I give you my answer," she said carefully, "I need to know more about what you're proposing. Would this be a temporary arrangement until the child is born or something more permanent?" Xavier considered her question. "I wouldn't put an expiration date on it. Marriage should be entered with the intention of permanence, even one like this." He paused, measuring his words, "But I wouldn't hold you if you became unhappy or found a better situation." "And the child," Rebecca pressed, "would you claim it as yours?" "As far as anyone would know, the child would be a king," Xavier replied without hesitation. "I'd raise it as my own, give it my name, my protection, and my inheritance." The generosity of his offer brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. "Why would you do all this for a stranger's child?" Xavier's gaze dropped to his coffee cup. "Because every child deserves a father who wants them," he said simply, "and because I've always wanted a family of my own." Rebecca took a deep breath, the pieces falling into place. "You lost more than your sister that day, didn't you?" A muscle worked in Xavier's jaw. "My fiancée left me when I insisted on taking in Sarah and her baby, said she wouldn't raise another woman's bastard." The harsh word hung in the air between them. "I realized then what kind of woman I'd almost married." "I'm sorry," Rebecca said softly. "That must have been difficult." Xavier shrugged, though the casual gesture couldn't disguise the old pain in his eyes. "It taught me what matters. Family isn't always about blood." Rebecca placed her hand over his on the table, the first time she'd initiated contact between them. His skin was warm and rough beneath her fingers. "Yes," she said quietly. Xavier looked up, confusion flickering across his face. "Yes, I'll marry you," Rebecca clarified, her heart racing at the enormity of what she was agreeing to, "if your offer still stands." For a moment, Xavier simply stared at her as if he hadn't expected her to accept. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming his features and revealing the dimple she'd noticed yesterday. "The offer stands," he confirmed, turning his hand to squeeze hers gently. "When?" Rebecca asked, practical considerations already filling her mind. "And how will we explain?" She gestured to her rounded belly. "Today, if possible," Xavier replied. "As for explanations, we'll stick to what I said yesterday. We were married back east, and you've come to join me now that I've prepared our home." He paused, considering. "We'll need to create some documentation, of course. I know the county clerk. He owes me a favor." Rebecca's eyebrows rose at this casual reference to falsifying records, but she said nothing. Her situation had already pushed her far beyond the boundaries of proper behavior. "After we're legally married," Xavier continued, "we'll hold a small reception here at the ranch. Nothing elaborate, just enough to introduce you as my wife and put any rumors to rest." The efficiency with which he outlined their plan both impressed and unnerved Rebecca. "You've thought this through?" Xavier's expression turned serious. "I don't enter into commitments lightly, Rebecca. When I saw you yesterday, I recognized something in you, a determination, a dignity despite your circumstances. I believe we can make this work if we're honest with each other and respectful of boundaries." "I agree," Rebecca said, withdrawing her hand from his and folding it in her lap. "But we should establish those boundaries clearly." Xavier nodded. "Fair enough. What would you like to discuss?" Rebecca gathered her courage. "As I mentioned yesterday, I won't be sharing your bed, at least not immediately." Her cheeks burned at her own boldness. "I've already agreed to that," Xavier reminded her gently. "The master bedroom is yours. I'll continue to use the room off the study." "And the child," Rebecca continued. "I appreciate your willingness to claim it as yours, but I want to be clear that I am its mother. Any decisions about its upbringing will be made jointly." "Of course," Xavier agreed readily. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Rebecca hesitated before voicing her next concern. And if feelings should develop between us, we'll discuss them openly before acting on them. A flicker of something passed through Xavier's eyes, amusement, perhaps, or interest. That seems wise, he said. Anything else? Rebecca considered. I'd like to contribute to the household. I was trained as a teacher before. She trailed off, not wanting to dwell on the circumstances that had led her here. We could use a schoolteacher in Bitter Creek, Xavier said thoughtfully. The children currently ride to Sweetwater for their education. It's a long journey, especially in winter. The idea kindled excitement in Rebecca's chest. Do you think the town would accept me as their teacher? As Mrs. Xavier King, respectable rancher's wife, Xavier smiled. I don't see why not, especially once you've had a chance to establish yourself in the community. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, Rebecca felt a spark of hope for her future. Then I believe we have an agreement, Mr. King. Xavier stood and extended his hand formally, as if sealing a business transaction. We do indeed, soon to be Mrs. King. Rebecca took his hand, and they shook on their unusual bargain, neither quite prepared for the journey that lay ahead. The county courthouse was a modest brick building at the end of Bitter Creek's Main Street. Rebecca clutched Xavier's arm as they climbed the steps, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wore her best dress, a deep green that brought out the color of her eyes, and Xavier had donned a clean shirt and string tie for the occasion. Are you certain about this? Xavier murmured as they paused outside the clerk's office. There's still time to change your mind. Rebecca shook her head, her resolve strengthening. I'm certain, are you? His answer was to push open the door, ushering her into a cramped office where a balding man in spectacles hunched over a ledger. Morning, Edgar, Xavier called, causing the clerk to look up with surprise. Xavier King, the man exclaimed, rising to his feet. Twice in town in as many days must be some kind of record. Xavier smiled easily. Special circumstances, Edgar. I'd like you to meet Rebecca Jones, my fiancée. Edgar's eyes widened as he took in Rebecca's condition, but to his credit, his expression remained neutral as he extended his hand. Miss Jones, a pleasure. We'd like to make it official, Xavier continued. Today, if possible. Edgar glanced between them, understanding dawning on his face. I see. Well, I suppose Judge Wilson could squeeze you in before lunch. He reached for a form in his desk drawer. Fill this out and I'll see if he's available. While Xavier completed the paperwork, Rebecca sat nervously, her hands folded over her belly. The baby shifted restlessly, as if sensing her anxiety. It'll be all right, Xavier whispered, covering her hand with his. Trust me. Before she could respond, Edgar returned with a thin, white-haired man in a rumpled suit. Judge Wilson has graciously agreed to perform the ceremony now, he announced. The wedding itself was brief and unceremonious, a few formal questions, the exchange of simple vows, and the signing of the marriage certificate. Xavier produced a plain gold band from his pocket, sliding it onto Rebecca's finger with surprising tenderness. Where did you get this? She whispered as Judge Wilson pronounced them husband and wife. It was my mother's, Xavier replied quietly. I hope you don't mind. Before Rebecca could process the significance of his gesture, the judge cleared his throat. You may kiss your bride, Mr. King. Rebecca froze, realizing they hadn't discussed this particular aspect of the ceremony. Xavier hesitated only a moment before leaning in to press a chaste kiss to her lips, brief but warm, sending an unexpected flutter through her chest. Congratulations, Judge Wilson said, clasping Xavier's hand. May you have many happy years together. As they stepped back into the sunlight as husband and wife, Rebecca felt a curious mixture of relief and trepidation. She was no longer Rebecca Jones, unwed mother-to-be, but Mrs. Xavier King, respectable rancher's wife. The transformation was both liberating and dizzying. Are you all right? Xavier asked as he helped her into the wagon he'd brought for the occasion, his hand steady at her elbow. Yes, she assured him, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. It's just rather overwhelming. Xavier climbed up beside her, taking the reins. I imagine so. Would you like to go straight home, or do you feel up to making a few stops in town? Rebecca straightened her shoulders. If we're to establish our story, we should be seen together, shouldn't we? Xavier's approval showed in his smile. My thoughts exactly. We'll start with Pemberton's General Store. It's the heart of town gossip. The bell above the door jingled as they entered the mercantile, where several women were examining bolts of fabric. Conversation died immediately as all eyes turned to the newlyweds. Mr. King, the shopkeeper greeted, his curious gaze sliding to Rebecca. What can I do for you today? Xavier's arm slipped around Rebecca's waist, a gesture that was becoming strangely familiar. George, I'd like to introduce my wife, Rebecca. We were married in Boston before she made the journey west. The stunned silence that followed was broken by Mrs. Harris, who had been selecting buttons near the counter. Your wife, but yesterday she introduced herself as Miss Jones. Xavier's expression remained pleasantly neutral. Force of habit, I suppose. Rebecca was a teacher back east, Miss Jones to her students for many years. Rebecca seized on this addition to their story. Indeed, professional habits can be difficult to break. A teacher, George Pemberton perked up. Now that's interesting. We've been hoping to establish a proper school here in Bitter Creek. Rebecca would be happy to discuss the possibility once she's settled in, Xavier replied smoothly. But today, we're here for household essentials. My bachelor supplies won't suffice for a lady. They spent the next half hour selecting items: tea, sugar, coffee, soap, and fabric for curtains while fielding curious questions from the townsfolk who happened to stop by the store. Rebecca marveled at Xavier's easy manner, the way he fielded inquiries without a hint of discomfort at their fabricated history. We're having a small gathering at the ranch on Saturday, he announced as they prepared to leave. Nothing fancy, just a chance for Rebecca to meet our neighbors properly. By the time they left the store, their marriage was the confirmed talk of the town. Xavier helped Rebecca back into the wagon, handing her the parcels before climbing up beside her. You were magnificent, he said quietly as they pulled away. A natural actress. Rebecca's cheeks warmed at the praise. I simply followed your lead. You spin quite a convincing tale. The best lies contain elements of truth, Xavier replied, his eyes on the road. You were a teacher, after all. Rebecca glanced at him in surprise. How did you know that? A hint of a smile played at the corner of his mouth. You mentioned it this morning, but I suspected it yesterday. You have a certain way of speaking, precise and thoughtful. It's the mark of an educated woman. My father was a professor, Rebecca explained, touched by his observation. He believed his daughters should be as well educated as his sons. Tell me about your family, Xavier encouraged as they left the town behind. If we're to be convincing as husband and wife, we should know these things about each other. Rebecca hesitated, painful memories surfacing. There's not much to tell. My parents died of influenza 3 years ago. My older brother Thomas took over the family home in Boston, but his wife and we never got along well. And when you found yourself in trouble, Xavier prompted gently. Rebecca stared at her hands, the new ring glinting in the sunlight. Thomas would have stood by me, but Charlotte threatened to leave him if he brought scandal to the family. He offered money instead of support. The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. I refused it and left with what savings I had. Xavier's jaw tightened. Your brother chose poorly? Perhaps, Rebecca acknowledged. But what of your family? You mentioned your sister, but what about your parents? My father was a Texas Ranger who settled here after the war, Xavier said, pride evident in his tone. He built this ranch from nothing. My mother was the daughter of a local doctor, too refined for frontier life, according to most, but she loved my father enough to make it work. They sound remarkable, Rebecca observed. They were, Xavier agreed. They died within months of each other. 6 years ago, father from a fall while breaking a horse, mother from pneumonia the following winter. And it's been just you since then, Rebecca asked, until your sister came to stay. Xavier nodded. Sarah lived with me for nearly a year before he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The ranch has been quiet since. Rebecca found herself reaching for his hand, squeezing it gently. It won't be quiet anymore, she promised. Not with a baby on the way. The tension in Xavier's expression eased, replaced by something warmer. No, I suppose it won't. He paused, then added, I should show you the nursery when we get back. The nursery, as it turned out, was a small room adjacent to the master bedroom. Xavier opened the door with a touch of hesitation, as if unsure of her reaction. Rebecca stepped inside and gasped softly. The room was painted a soft yellow, with white curtains framing the window that overlooked the garden. A handcrafted wooden crib stood in one corner and a rocking chair padded with cushions in the other. A small bookshelf held a collection of children's stories, and a colorful quilt was folded neatly at the foot of the crib. Xavier, she breathed, turning to find him watching her intently. It's beautiful. Sarah started it, he explained, running his hand over the crib rail. I finished it after. Well, I couldn't bear to leave it incomplete. Rebecca moved to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of the volumes. These were yours as a child, Xavier nodded. My mother read to us every night. I thought your little one might enjoy them too. The simple statement, delivered so matter-of-factly, brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. In Boston, the father of her child had recoiled at the news of her pregnancy, calling it an inconvenience and a trap. Yet here was this man, this stranger, who was now her husband, embracing her child before it was even born. Thank you, she whispered, unable to express the depth of her gratitude. Xavier shifted uncomfortably under her emotional gaze. It's nothing, he demurred. Just practical preparations. But they both knew it was far more than that. The days leading up to their reception passed in a whirlwind of activity. Rebecca threw herself into making the ranch house more of a home, hanging curtains, rearranging furniture, and adding feminine touches that transformed the bachelor dwelling into a family home. Xavier watched her work with quiet amusement, offering help when needed, but mostly giving her the freedom to make the space her own. They fell into a rhythm surprisingly quickly, Xavier rising before dawn to tend to the ranch, Rebecca preparing meals and keeping the house. In the evenings, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, or in the parlor where Xavier read aloud while Rebecca mended clothing. It was a domestic tranquility that neither had expected but both found comforting. On the morning of the reception, Rebecca woke to the sound of voices outside. Peering through the window, she saw Xavier directing several ranch hands as they set up tables and benches in the yard beneath the cottonwoods. She dressed carefully in a blue dress that Xavier had insisted on buying her in town, the fabric generously cut to accommodate her growing belly. As she pinned up her hair, she studied her reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. There was color in her cheeks and a brightness in her eyes that had been absent for months. You look lovely, Xavier said from the doorway, startling her. He leaned against the frame, hat in hand, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Thank you, she replied, a blush warming her cheeks. And thank you for the dress, it's far too extravagant. Xavier shook his head. Not at all, my wife should have pretty things. There was a teasing note in his voice, but something else too, a hint of genuine pleasure at seeing her in the gift he'd chosen. Is everything ready outside? Rebecca asked, pinning the last strand of hair in place. Nearly, Xavier confirmed. Mrs. Palmer from the neighboring ranch brought over enough food to feed an army, and Pastor Jenkins arrived early to bless the house. He hesitated before adding, I hope you don't mind, but I told him we'd appreciate a blessing for the baby as well. Rebecca's hand moved automatically to her abdomen. You did, Xavier misinterpreted her surprise as disapproval. I thought it might help cement our story, he explained quickly. If the pastor acknowledges the child as legitimate, others will follow his lead. No, it's a wonderful idea, Rebecca assured him. I just didn't expect you to think of it. Relief flickered across Xavier's face. Good, the guests will begin arriving soon. Are you ready for this? Rebecca took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. As ready as I'll ever be. The reception was larger than Rebecca had anticipated. It seemed the entire town of Bitter Creek had turned out to meet the mysterious Eastern bride of Xavier King. Women brought covered dishes and scrutinized Rebecca with barely concealed curiosity, while men clapped Xavier on the back and made jokes about his secretive courtship. Through it all, Xavier remained at Rebecca's side, his hand often finding the small of her back or her elbow in gestures that appeared casual but felt protective. He fielded questions about their courtship with ease, weaving a tale of meetings in Boston while he was there on business, letters exchanged over months, and a quick wedding before he returned west. "And when is the blessed event expected?" Mrs. Pemberton asked bluntly, eyeing Rebecca's rounded figure. "November," Rebecca replied, having calculated the timing carefully. "Just before Thanksgiving." "A fine harvest indeed," Pastor Jenkins interjected with a benevolent smile. "Children are a blessing from the Lord, especially when born into a loving marriage." The pastor's endorsement worked exactly as Xavier had predicted. The last traces of suspicion seemed to fade from the guests' expressions, replaced by genuine goodwill. Several of the town's prominent women offered advice on childbirth and infant care, while others expressed interest in Rebecca's teaching background. "We've been trying to establish a proper school for years," Mrs. Wilson, the judge's wife, explained eagerly. "Currently, we have 15 children riding to Sweetwater 3 days a week, which is simply impractical once winter sets in." "I'd be happy to discuss possibilities," Rebecca offered, genuinely excited by the prospect. "Perhaps after the baby comes." "Oh, but we couldn't possibly wait that long," Mrs. Wilson interrupted. "We need to begin immediately if we're to have arrangements in place before winter. Perhaps you could hold a meeting with the parents next week." Xavier appeared at Rebecca's side, having overheard the conversation. "My wife is still settling in, Margaret," he reminded Mrs. Wilson gently. "Perhaps in a few weeks." "No, it's all right," Rebecca assured him, touched by his protectiveness but unwilling to miss this opportunity. "I'd be delighted to meet with the parents. Education shouldn't wait." Xavier studied her face for a moment before nodding. "If you're certain, but don't overtax yourself." As the afternoon wore on, Rebecca found herself genuinely enjoying the company of her new neighbors. The women of Bitter Creek might gossip, but they were also generous and practical, offering friendship along with their casseroles and advice. By sunset, the last guests had departed, leaving Xavier and Rebecca alone amid the remnants of the celebration. Rebecca sank gratefully into a chair, massaging her swollen ankles. "That went well," Xavier observed, handing her a cup of tea before taking a seat beside her. "I think you've won them over." "They're good people," Rebecca agreed, different from Boston society but refreshingly direct. Xavier smiled. "That's a diplomatic way of putting it. Bitter Creek folks call a spade a spade." "And yet they accepted our story without much question," Rebecca mused. "They accepted what they wanted to believe," Xavier corrected. "A romantic tale is always preferable to a scandal, especially when the alternative might require them to show Christian charity." The cynicism in his tone surprised her. "You don't think much of their charity," Xavier sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've seen how quickly it can turn to judgment. When Sarah needed understanding, she found condemnation instead." Rebecca reached for his hand impulsively. "I'm sorry for what happened to your sister, and I'm grateful that you didn't let the same happen to me." Xavier's fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. "You've nothing to be grateful for. Any decent man would have done the same." "We both know that's not true," Rebecca countered softly. "The father of my child certainly didn't." A muscle twitched in Xavier's jaw at the mention of her baby's father. "Tell me about him," he said after a moment. "If you don't mind." Rebecca hesitated, the wound still fresh despite the months that had passed. "His name was William Harrington. He was a banker in Boston, married with 3 children." She couldn't meet Xavier's eyes as she continued. "I was hired to tutor his daughter in literature. He was charming, attentive. I thought he loved me." "And when you told him about the baby," Xavier prompted gently. Rebecca's laugh was hollow. He offered me money for a solution. When I refused, he threatened to ruin my reputation if I tried to claim the child was his. She brushed away a tear that had escaped despite her resolve. He was right, of course. No one would believe a teacher's word over that of a prominent banker. Xavier's expression darkened. Men like that deserve a special place in hell. Perhaps, Rebecca acknowledged, but dwelling on it serves no purpose. I've made my peace with raising this child alone. Not alone, Xavier corrected firmly. Not anymore. The conviction in his voice warmed something inside Rebecca that had been cold for too long. No, she agreed, not alone. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell, the only sound the gentle creaking of their rocking chairs and the chorus of crickets in the garden. It wasn't love, Rebecca thought, but it was something equally valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. For now, that was enough. The weeks passed, summer yielding to autumn with a gradual shifting of colors across the Wyoming landscape. Rebecca's days fell into a pleasant routine: mornings spent keeping house, afternoons dedicated to organizing the new school that would open after harvest, and evenings in Xavier's company, talking or reading by the fire. Their marriage remained unconsummated, as agreed, though Rebecca couldn't help noticing the way Xavier's gaze sometimes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. There was a growing ease between them, small touches and shared smiles that hinted at something deeper than their practical arrangement. As her pregnancy advanced, Xavier's protectiveness increased. He insisted on hiring a young woman from town to help with the heavier housework, fretting when Rebecca exerted herself too much in her enthusiasm for the school project. "The baby will be here before you know it," he reminded her one evening as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You should be resting more." Rebecca smiled, her hand resting on her prominent belly. "I'm perfectly healthy, Xavier, doctor. Matthews said so just yesterday." "All the same," Xavier persisted, "I worry about you doing too much." The concern in his voice touched her deeply. "The school committee meets tomorrow to finalize the building plans," she said, changing the subject. "They've found a vacant building on the edge of town that needs only minor repairs." Xavier nodded, his expression thoughtful. "They're lucky to have you. The children of Bitter Creek will benefit from a proper education." "I hope so," Rebecca said earnestly. "Every child deserves the opportunity to learn, regardless of circumstances." Xavier's gaze turned to her belly. "And our child, what do you hope for him or her?" The question gave Rebecca pause. She had been so focused on surviving her pregnancy and establishing herself in Bitter Creek that she had given little thought to the future beyond the baby's birth. "I hope for a child who knows they are wanted and loved," she said finally, "who grows up with security and purpose." She hesitated before adding, "And I hope they never feel the sting of being judged for circumstances beyond their control." Xavier reached across the space between their chairs to take her hand, a gesture that had become increasingly common between them. "On that we are agreed," he said firmly. "This child will know only love and acceptance in our home, our home." The phrase sent a warm flutter through Rebecca's chest. Somehow, in the span of weeks, this place had indeed become home, and Xavier had become what? Not quite a husband in the traditional sense, but far more than a convenient protector. "Xavier," she began, unsure how to express the gratitude and confusion swirling within her. "I want you to know," she broke off with a gasp as a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen. Her hand clutched at her belly instinctively. Xavier was on his feet instantly, kneeling before her. "What is it, the baby?" Rebecca shook her head, trying to catch her breath. "Just a twinge. Dr. Matthews said to expect false pains as my time approaches," but Xavier wasn't convinced. "Let's get you inside," he insisted, helping her to her feet with gentle hands. "You should lie down." Rebecca allowed him to guide her to the bedroom, touched by his concern even as she tried to dismiss it as unnecessary. The pain had already subsided, leaving only a dull ache in its wake. "There," she said as she sat on the edge of the bed. "All better. You worry too much." Xavier frowned, his blue eyes dark with concern. "Promise me you'll rest tomorrow instead of going to town." Rebecca opened her mouth to protest, then closed it at the genuine worry in his expression. "Very well," she conceded. "I'll send a note explaining my absence." Satisfied, Xavier nodded. "Good, I'll bring you some tea before bed." As he turned to leave, Rebecca caught his hand. "Xavier," she said softly, "thank you for caring about us." Something flickered across his face, an emotion too complex to name. "Get some rest," he said gruffly, but his fingers squeezed hers gently before he withdrew. Alone in the room that had become hers, Rebecca changed into her nightgown and slipped beneath the covers, her mind turning over the strange path her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been desperate and alone, facing a bleak future as an unwed mother. Now she was Rebecca King, respected wife of one of Bitter Creek's most prominent ranchers, with a teaching position awaiting her and a community that had accepted her with open arms. All because a stranger had looked at her and seen not disgrace, but dignity worth preserving. The thought brought tears to her eyes as she drifted towards sleep, her hand resting protectively over the child that would, thanks to Xavier, enter the world bearing his name and protection. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect autumn day. Rebecca woke feeling surprisingly refreshed, with no recurrence of the pain that had alarmed Xavier the previous evening. She dressed and made her way to the kitchen, where she found a note propped against the coffee pot. "Gone to check the north pasture. Rest today as promised, back by noon." Rebecca smiled at his thoughtfulness, pouring herself a cup of the coffee he'd left brewing. She was just considering what to prepare for breakfast when another pain seized her, sharper than before, causing her to drop the cup with a crash. "Oh," she gasped, clutching the edge of the table as the contraction squeezed her midsection. This was no false pain, this was different, more intense, more purposeful. When it passed, Rebecca took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. It was too soon, the baby wasn't due for another 3 weeks. But Dr. Matthews had warned that first babies sometimes came early. "Stay calm," she told herself aloud. "Xavier will be back by noon." She cleaned up the broken cup and made her way to the parlor, where she could rest on the sofa and watch for Xavier's return. Another contraction gripped her as she settled onto the cushions, stronger than the last. Rebecca bit her lip to keep from crying out, breathing through the pain as Dr. Matthews had instructed. The contractions continued, growing closer together and more intense as the morning wore on. By 11 o'clock, Rebecca knew she couldn't wait for Xavier's return. The baby was coming, and coming quickly. She tried to stand, thinking to make her way to the neighbor's ranch for help, but another contraction drove her to her knees, a cry escaping her lips. The pain was overwhelming now, her body taken over by forces beyond her control. "Xavier," she called out, knowing he couldn't hear her but unable to stop herself. "Please come back." As if in answer to her plea, she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching, followed by the creak of the front door opening. "Rebecca," Xavier's voice called. "I came back early." "The weather's turning," he broke off as he entered the parlor and saw her on the floor, her face contorted with pain. In an instant he was beside her, his strong arms supporting her. "The baby," she gasped as the contraction eased. "It's coming." Xavier's face paled, but his voice remained steady. "I'll get you to the doctor." Rebecca shook her head. "No time," she panted, "too close together." "Help me to the bedroom." Xavier lifted her as if she weighed nothing, carrying her swiftly to the bedroom and laying her gently on the bed. Another contraction seized her, and she clutched his hand, her nails digging into his palm. "What do I do?" he asked, his usual confidence replaced by naked fear. "Rebecca, I don't know how to deliver a baby." "Sheets," she managed as the pain subsided. "Clean sheets, water, towels." Xavier nodded, squeezing her hand before releasing it. "I'll be right back, hold on." He returned moments later with an armful of linens and a basin of water, his face set in determined lines. "I've sent one of the hands for Dr. Matthews, but it'll take time for him to get here." Rebecca nodded, already feeling the next contraction building. "We may not have time," she warned. "The baby is coming fast." Xavier's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Then we'll do this together," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Tell me what you need." What followed was a blur of pain and fear, punctuated by moments of clarity in which Rebecca gave instructions, and Xavier followed them with steady hands despite the terror evident in his eyes. He wiped her brow, supported her back when she needed to push, and murmured encouragement when her strength faltered. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known," he told her as she struggled through a particularly difficult contraction. "You can do this, Rebecca. I'm right here." His unwavering presence gave her courage, his hand in hers an anchor in the storm of pain. When the final moment came, it was Xavier who guided the baby into the world, his voice breaking as he announced, "It's a girl. Rebecca, we have a daughter." The sound of the baby's first cry filled the room, and Rebecca collapsed against the pillows, exhausted but elated. Xavier placed the tiny, squirming bundle on her chest, his hands shaking slightly as he covered them both with a clean blanket. "She's perfect," Rebecca whispered, tears streaming down her face as she gazed at her daughter's scrunched features. Tiny fists waved in the air and eyes the same shade of blue as Xavier's blinked up at her with unfocused curiosity. "She is," Xavier agreed, his voice thick with emotion. He sat on the edge of the bed, one hand gently stroking the baby's dark hair. Just like her mother, Rebecca looked up at him, seeing the wonder and tenderness in his expression. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Xavier shook his head, his eyes never leaving the baby. "No, Rebecca. Thank you for bringing this miracle into our home." He hesitated before asking, "What will you name her?" Rebecca hadn't given much thought to names, half convinced during her darkest days that she wouldn't be allowed to keep her child. Now, looking at the tiny face that somehow combined her own features with hints of the man who had given her his name and protection, she knew. "Sarah," she said quietly, "after your sister. Sarah Hope King." Xavier's head jerked up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "You would do that. She brought us together," Rebecca explained. "In a way, at least, and I want our daughter to know the aunt who indirectly gave her a father." Xavier blinked rapidly, clearly fighting tears. "Sarah Hope," he repeated, testing the name. "It's beautiful." The tender moment was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Matthews, who took over with brisk efficiency, checking both mother and child before pronouncing them healthy despite the early delivery. "You did well, Mr. King," the doctor said approvingly as he packed up his bag. "Not many men would have the nerve to deliver their own child." Xavier accepted the praise with a nod, though Rebecca noticed the way his hands still trembled slightly. The experience had shaken him. She realized not just the medical emergency, but the emotional impact of bringing a new life into the world. Once the doctor had gone, promising to return the next day, Xavier helped Rebecca change into a clean nightgown and settled her comfortably in the freshly made bed. Little Sarah slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle beside them, swaddled in soft blankets. "You should rest," Xavier told Rebecca, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead with gentle fingers. "You've been through an ordeal." Rebecca caught his hand before he could withdraw it. "Stay," she requested softly, "just for a while." Xavier hesitated only a moment before sitting beside her on the bed, his back against the headboard. Rebecca leaned into his side, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I was so afraid," she admitted in a whisper, "not just of the pain, but of doing it alone." Xavier's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her closer. "You're not alone, Rebecca. Not anymore." The simple statement, delivered with such conviction, broke something open inside her, a wall she hadn't realized she'd built around her heart. Tears flowed freely as she buried her face against his chest. Years of loneliness and months of fear finally finding release. Xavier held her through the storm, his hand stroking her hair, his voice a soothing murmur in her ear. When at last her tears subsided, Rebecca lifted her face to find him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Xavier," she began, not sure what she wanted to say but knowing something had fundamentally changed between them. He silenced her with a gentle finger against her lips. "Rest now," he said softly. "We have time for talking later." Rebecca nodded, suddenly exhausted. She settled against the pillows, her eyes already growing heavy. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was Xavier's lips pressing a tender kiss to her forehead and his whispered words, "My brave, beautiful wife." The weeks following Sarah's birth passed in a haze of exhaustion and joy. Rebecca learned the rhythms of motherhood, the sleepless nights, the overwhelming love, the constant wonder at the tiny life she had created. Through it all, Xavier was an unwavering presence, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with a fussy Sarah in the early hours, and ensuring Rebecca had everything she needed to recover her strength. The townspeople of Bitter Creek embraced little Sarah with enthusiasm, bringing gifts and meals and cooing over the image of her father, a comment that never failed to bring a flush to Rebecca's cheeks and a mysterious smile to Xavier's lips. As winter settled over the ranch, wrapping the landscape in a blanket of snow, the little family fell into a comfortable routine. Xavier spent the daylight hours tending to the ranch, returning each evening to spend time with his wife and daughter. Rebecca recovered her strength gradually, resuming household duties and corresponding with the school committee about plans for the spring term. Yet beneath the domestic tranquility, something had shifted between them. There were lingering glances, fingers that touched a moment too long when passing the baby, conversations that trailed into meaningful silence. The boundaries they had established in their marriage of convenience seemed increasingly arbitrary as genuine affection blossomed between them. One evening in early December, with a snowstorm howling outside the windows, Rebecca sat in the parlor nursing Sarah while Xavier built up the fire. The baby had fallen asleep at her breast, milk-drunk and content, her tiny hand curled around Rebecca's finger. "She looks more like you every day," Xavier observed, settling into the chair opposite hers. The firelight played across his features, softening the angles of his face and highlighting the warmth in his eyes as he gazed at their daughter. "You think so?" Rebecca asked, adjusting her clothing as she shifted Sarah to her shoulder. "I see more of her father in her." Xavier's expression flickered, a shadow passing across his face at the reference to Sarah's biological father. "Harrington doesn't deserve to claim any part of her," he said, his voice low. "She's a king." The fierceness of his declaration startled Rebecca. "Yes, she is," she agreed softly. "Thanks to you." Xavier's gaze moved from the baby to Rebecca's face, studying her with an intensity that made her heart race. "You've given me more than I gave you," he said finally, "a purpose. A family." "We've given each other what we needed," Rebecca corrected gently. "A fresh start." Xavier nodded, his expression thoughtful. After a moment, he rose from his chair and crossed to the small desk in the corner, retrieving a document from the drawer. "I had Edgar draw this up last week," he explained, returning to hand the paper to Rebecca. "It's adoption papers for Sarah. If you're willing to sign them, she'll legally be my daughter in every sense." Rebecca blinked back sudden tears as she scanned the document, recognizing its significance. "You want to adopt her?" "I want her to be mine in the eyes of the law as well as in my heart," Xavier confirmed, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I want her to inherit this ranch without question when the time comes, and to know without doubt that she is my daughter." Rebecca looked down at the sleeping infant in her arms, then back at the man who had given them both his name and protection without hesitation. "You already are her father in every way that matters," she said softly. "But yes, I'll sign." Relief and something deeper flickered across Xavier's face. He knelt beside her chair, one hand gently stroking Sarah's back while the other came to rest on Rebecca's knee. "There's something else," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Something I've wanted to say for some time now." Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs as she met his intense gaze. Yes, Xavier took a deep breath as if gathering courage. When I first saw you stepping off that stagecoach, I acted on instinct to protect you to prevent another tragedy like Sarah's, but these past months. Being with you, watching you create a home here, seeing you with our daughter. He faltered, then continued with renewed determination. Rebecca, I've fallen in love with you. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Rebecca sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter this perfect moment. You don't have to return the feeling, Xavier added quickly, misinterpreting her silence. Our arrangement can continue as before. I just wanted you to know I love you too, Rebecca interrupted, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. I think I have for some time now. Xavier's expression transformed, hope and joy spreading across his features. You do? Rebecca nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. How could I not? You've shown me what a true partner, a true man should be, not with grand gestures or empty promises, but with daily kindness and unwavering support. Xavier's hand moved from her knee to cup her cheek, his touch reverent. May I kiss you? He asked, the formality of the question at odds with the desire evident in his eyes. As a husband kisses his wife, in answer, Rebecca leaned forward, mindful of the sleeping baby between them, and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, a tentative exploration, but it quickly deepened as months of suppressed longing found expression. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. I want a real marriage with you, Rebecca, he murmured, in every sense. I want that too, she admitted, her cheeks flushing at her own boldness. Very much. Xavier's smile was slow and tender as he rose to his feet, extending his hand to her. Then let me put our daughter to bed, he suggested, carefully lifting Sarah from Rebecca's arms. And afterward, we can begin our marriage properly. Rebecca watched as he carried Sarah to the nursery with confident gentleness, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain. Their beginning had been unconventional, a marriage built on compassion rather than passion, on mutual need rather than love. But somewhere along the way, genuine feelings had blossomed in the fertile soil of respect and kindness. When Xavier returned, his eyes dark with promise as he extended his hand once more, Rebecca rose to meet him, stepping willingly into the arms of the man who had claimed her when no one else would, who had proudly declared she's mine to a judgmental world, and who now claimed her heart as she claimed his. Their second wedding night, their true wedding night, was everything their hasty courthouse ceremony had not been. Tender, passionate, and sealed with love freely given and joyfully received. Spring came early to Wyoming that year, the snow melting to reveal tender green shoots pushing through the soil. On a warm April morning, Rebecca stood on the porch of the schoolhouse, a renovated storefront at the edge of town, watching as mothers brought their children for the first day of classes. Mrs. King, greeted Mrs. Wilson with a warm smile. Timothy has talked of nothing else for weeks. You've brought a great service to our community. Rebecca smiled, bouncing 5-month-old Sarah on her hip. The baby gurgled happily, reaching for the colorful ribbons in Mrs. Wilson's bonnet. It's my pleasure, Rebecca replied sincerely. Every child deserves an education. As the classroom filled with excited children, Rebecca felt a familiar presence at her back. She turned to find Xavier leaning against the doorframe, hat in hand, watching her with undisguised pride. I thought I'd escort my 2 favorite ladies home after school, he explained, stepping forward to place a kiss on Sarah's cheek, then Rebecca's lips. If the teacher doesn't mind. The teacher would appreciate it very much, Rebecca replied with a smile. Especially since she has news to share. Xavier's brow furrowed slightly. News? Rebecca handed Sarah to him, enjoying the way the baby immediately snuggled against her father's broad chest. News that might necessitate finding an assistant teacher by autumn, she said meaningfully, her hand drifting to her still flat stomach. Understanding dawned slowly across Xavier's face, followed by a joy so pure it took Rebecca's breath away. "Truly," he whispered, shifting Sarah to one arm so he could place his free hand over Rebecca's abdomen. "Another baby," Rebecca nodded, covering his hand with her own. "Doctor Matthews confirmed it yesterday. We'll welcome another little king around Thanksgiving." Xavier let out a whoop that startled Sarah and drew curious stares from the assembled children. Oblivious to their audience, he pulled Rebecca into a one-armed embrace, pressing fervent kisses to her temple. "You've made me the happiest man in Wyoming territory," he declared, his voice thick with emotion. Rebecca laughed, joy bubbling up from deep within her. "Even happier than when Thunderbolt won the county race last month." "Even happier than that," Xavier confirmed solemnly, though his eyes danced with humor. "Though it's a close contest." Their laughter mingled in the spring air, drawing smiles from the watching mothers and giggles from the children. No one seeing them now would question the love between them, or the legitimacy of the family they were building. As Xavier reluctantly released her so she could begin her first day of teaching, he whispered in her ear, "I'll be back at 3 o'clock sharp. Don't keep me waiting, Mrs. King." Rebecca watched him stride away, Sarah babbling happily in his arms, and marveled at the journey that had brought them here. From the moment of humiliation on Bitter Creek's Main Street to this perfect happiness, a husband who adored her, a daughter who thrived under their love, another child growing beneath her heart, and a community that respected her skills and contributions. All because one man had looked beyond scandal to see her worth, had declared "she's mine" when others would have turned away, and had proven with each passing day that love could indeed grow from the most unlikely beginnings. As Rebecca turned to face her classroom of eager students, she silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought her to Bitter Creek, Wyoming, and into the arms of Xavier King, her cowboy, her protector, her husband, and now, most precious of all, her love. "Good morning, children," she began, her voice strong and clear. "Welcome to your first day of school. My name is Mrs. King, and I can't wait to begin our journey together." Outside, the Wyoming sky stretched endless and blue above the frontier town, promising infinite possibilities for those brave enough to claim them. The years passed with the rhythm of seasons on the King Ranch. Sarah grew from a chubby infant into a spirited little girl with her mother's emerald eyes and her father's determined chin. Her brother Robert arrived right on schedule that Thanksgiving, followed 2 years later by twins Michael and Margaret, who entered the world on a snowy February night with the assistance of Dr. Matthews and a very nervous Xavier. The schoolhouse in Bitter Creek flourished under Rebecca's guidance, eventually expanding into a proper building with 2 classrooms as the town grew. Rebecca trained a young woman to take over the younger children, allowing her to focus on the older students and still have time for her growing family. Xavier's ranch prospered as well, his breeding program producing horses sought after throughout the territory. The modest home that had once seemed temporary to Rebecca became the heart of their expanding world, with additions built to accommodate their children and the frequent visitors who found welcome at their table. On a golden autumn afternoon in 1886, a decade after Rebecca had first stepped off the stagecoach into Bitter Creek, she sat on the porch swing watching Xavier teach 10-year-old Sarah to throw a lasso. Robert cheered his sister on while the 6-year-old twins rolled in the grass with a patient old sheepdog. "Ma, did you see that?" Sarah called excitedly as her loop settled neatly around the fence post Xavier had set up as a target. "Pa says I'm a natural." "I see," Rebecca called back with a smile. "You're getting better every day." Xavier beamed with pride, ruffling Sarah's dark curls. "She's got a good eye and steady hands. She'll be running this ranch one day." "With Rob's help," Sarah added generously, slinging an arm around her brother's shoulders. "He's better with the books than I am." Rebecca's heart swelled as she watched her children together. They were a true family, bonded by love rather than merely blood. Xavier had been as good as his word, raising Sarah as his own without distinction or reservation. To all appearances and in every way that mattered, she was his daughter, bearing his name with pride. The sound of an approaching wagon drew Rebecca's attention to the road. A familiar conveyance appeared, driven by Mrs. Harris, now in her 70s but still spry. "Company," Rebecca called to Xavier, who nodded and began herding the children toward the house to wash up. Mrs. Harris pulled the wagon to a stop, waving a letter. "Special delivery from back east," she announced as Xavier helped her down. "Too important to wait for regular mail." Rebecca accepted the envelope, noting the Boston postmark with surprise. It had been years since she'd had correspondence from her former home. She thanked Mrs. Harris and invited her in for refreshment, but her attention remained on the letter as they moved into the house. Once the children were occupied with cookies and milk, and Mrs. Harris engaged in conversation with Xavier, Rebecca slipped into the study to open the mysterious missive. The contents made her sink slowly into Xavier's desk chair, her hand trembling slightly. She was still sitting there when Xavier found her sometime later after seeing Mrs. Harris off. "Rebecca," he asked, concern evident in his voice as he knelt beside her. "What is it? Bad news?" She handed him the letter wordlessly, watching as he scanned its contents. His expression darkened as he read, jaw tightening in the way she knew meant he was controlling anger. "Your brother Thomas has died," he summarized, looking up at her. "And his widow Charlotte wants to make amends by acknowledging Sarah as her niece and including her in Thomas's will." Rebecca nodded, still processing the unexpected development. "After all these years of silence," she said softly, "now that it's convenient for her." Xavier set the letter aside, taking both her hands in his. "What do you want to do?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. Once such recognition from her family would have meant everything to her: validation, security, connection to her past. Now it seemed almost irrelevant to the life they had built. "Nothing," she decided, squeezing Xavier's hands. "Sarah is a King, not a Jones. She has everything she needs right here: a father who loves her, siblings who adore her, and a future that's secure." Relief flickered across Xavier's face, followed by a deeper emotion that made her heart swell. After 10 years together, he still looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. "Are you certain?" he asked. "It's a substantial inheritance. It could be her dowry someday or help her establish herself if she chooses a path beyond the ranch." Rebecca smiled at his practical consideration. "If Charlotte truly wishes to make amends, she can establish a trust for Sarah's education. But I won't have our daughter thinking for one moment that she needed acknowledgement from strangers to be complete." Xavier rose, pulling Rebecca to her feet and into his embrace. "Have I told you today how much I love you, Mrs. King?" "Not since breakfast," Rebecca teased, tilting her face up for his kiss. "I believe you're falling behind schedule." Xavier's laugh rumbled through his chest as he tightened his arms around her. "I love you more today than yesterday, and less than I will tomorrow," he murmured, his lips brushing her temple. "You and the family we've built together are everything to me." "And you to me," Rebecca whispered, leaning into his strength. "From the moment you claimed me on that dusty street, my life has been richer than I ever dreamed possible." A chorus of childish voices calling for them broke the intimate moment. Xavier released her with a sigh, though he kept hold of her hand as they moved toward the door. "Duty calls," he said with a wink. "But later, when the children are asleep." The promise in his voice sent a pleasant shiver up Rebecca's spine, a reaction he could still evoke even after a decade of marriage. "I'll hold you to that, Mr. King." As they stepped into the main room to join their children, Rebecca felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. The path that had led her to Bitter Creek had been paved with heartbreak and scandal, but it had brought her to this moment, this family, this love. "Ma, Pa, can we ride out to the north pasture after supper?" Sarah asked eagerly. "Rob thinks he saw an eagle's nest in the old cottonwood." "If your chores are done and you help with the dishes," Xavier negotiated, winking at Rebecca. As the children chattered excitedly about their evening plans, Rebecca leaned into Xavier's side, his arm automatically wrapping around her waist in a gesture as familiar as breathing. This was what mattered, not society's approval or family legacies, but the life they had forged together against all odds. "She's mine," Xavier had declared that fateful day, claiming both Rebecca and her unborn child with proud defiance. The words echoed in Rebecca's memory, no longer a convenient fiction but a profound truth that defined their shared journey. She was his, and he was hers, and together they had built something far stronger than the scandal that had once threatened to define her. "Penny for your thoughts," Xavier murmured in her ear as the children raced off to complete their chores. Rebecca smiled up at him, this handsome cowboy who had become her heart's true home. "I was just thinking that sometimes the best journeys are the ones we never planned to take." Xavier's answering smile held all the warmth of the Wyoming sun. "As long as they lead us home in the end," he agreed, bending to seal the sentiment with a kiss that promised many more years of love to come.